In this episode, we're taking up the topic of goodness of creation. On one level, it would seem to be a rather straightforward topic, given what we read in Genesis 1. God calls his creation good 7 times in the first chapter.
On another level, a closer look at these verses provides better insight into the biblical understanding of the goodness of creation and how this relates to the fall of creation and original sin.
The Hebrew word translated into English as good is the word tob. We find this word first used in Genesis 1:4 in relation to God creating light. Commonly in English, when something is referred to as good, that object is understood as having a fixed quality. The quality typically is something sort of aesthetic appeal or characteristic. But such an understanding is deficient for the Hebrew word tob.
In verse 4, when God calls light tob, 2 things are clear. First of all, the light is good simply because God regards it as good. Second, recognition of creation by both God and humans is what establishes its goodness. In fact, the 38th chapter of the book of Job establishes this understanding as well. Job states that all creatures praise the Creator at the completion of the creation.
Psalm 148 also establishes a direct tie between the goodness of creation and the creatures praising God. So there's an inseparable connection between the account of creation and praising God the Creator in an acknowledgement of the goodness of God's creation. In other words, the goodness of creation is not simply an aesthetic judgment, such as the way the beauty of the mountains might be understood.
Now, to be clear, the recognition of the goodness of creation spoken in Genesis 4, as well as in Job and the Psalms, is not simply a matter of something existing, such as light itself. Rather, the acknowledgement of creation as good is because the created thing fulfills the purpose God intended for it.
Simply put, the created things are tob because they perform according to their nature and divinely intended purpose. In other words, they do precisely what God intended them to do. Take, for example, Genesis 1, verse 10. Martin Luther identified that God called the separation of land from the sea good because of the purpose God intended for the land, namely, where his creatures would dwell and the place God would support us with food and drink.
It's not good simply because the snow-topped mountains are pretty or the flowers in the field smell good.
We see further examples of this in verses 11 and 12. In verse 11, God creates by speaking, which establishes vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and trees bearing fruit. And then in verse 12, the trees bear fruit according to their kind. The sun shines, the plants yield seed. They do precisely what God intended them to do. Moreover, all of these created things are tob, good, because they all serve to support and nurture human life.
That second point may seem to be a stretch, but it is not. How so? Well, look at what God did on the 4th day, verses 14 through 19. He established the heavens above with stars, and he distinguished the day from the night. But note, tob was not declared at the end of the 4th day. Why? The creation of heavens, stars, and day and night aren't simply good in and of themselves. They don't serve a specific purpose for the sustenance of humankind.
So let's now turn to day 5, when God established living creatures. There are 2 things to note here. The first is the purpose of living creatures. And remember, their fulfilling of God's established purpose is what makes them good. So what is the purpose of the living creatures? Well, it's the same as the land. They were placed on earth to support and sustain humankind.
Now, it's important to note that something new showed up during the 5th day of creation. Not only did God call all creatures good, but on day 5, he turned and blessed them. Why the addition? As Luther points out, to be blessed by God is to be part of the procreative act God established with living creatures. God's blessing is to be fruitful and multiply.
That serves as a good segue into many of the misunderstandings and misappropriations related to talking about the goodness of creation and God's blessing thereof. The pitfalls people stumble into are not necessarily willful. Rather, in light of the fall, in the Garden of Eden, and original sin, as our evangelical perspective teaches, humans are bound to think this way.
Let's start by recalling what happened in the Garden of Eden. Adam was given a command: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now think of that in the context of what good means in the creation story.
We can paraphrase God's command by saying, don't try to determine for yourself the purpose and utility of God's creation. Simply receive these things and trust God's design as being beneficial for your life. Thus, you can eat of any tree in the garden, except the one that makes you a judge over God's intended design and purpose.
With that paraphrase in mind, listen to what Paul identifies as the root of sin in Romans 1, beginning with the 21st verse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools.
Now let's go back to the words of the devil's temptation in Genesis and note the correlation, starting with the 4th verse of Genesis 3. But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and she ate.
It is abundantly clear that the original sin was an attack on faith in God's spoken word. That word establishes the goodness of creation and the purpose of sustaining humankind. After eating the fruit, Adam and Eve became afraid and ashamed.
No longer was God's creation and command understood as being for them, but would now feel like an attack on their lives. And thus, as Paul identifies in Romans, humans fail to trust God as their creator and creation as a gift from God that will give them life and not cause their death.
With that in mind, let's return to what it means for creatures to receive God's blessing. It means to be a participant in God's creative activity, and not just a little, but abundantly. By contrast, listen to what God says to Adam and Eve after the fall in chapter 3. Rather than a blessing, God announces a curse, first to Eve and then to Adam. "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." And to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground."
Having those verses in your head, listen to Paul's words in Romans 8, starting with verse 19. "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption, and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies."
Clearly, Paul is echoing the pain of childbirth and the curse of God placed on creation after the fall. But Paul speaks this way because he knows that in the garden after the fall, the promised seed of the new creation in Christ was given, and the sin of the first Adam would be vanquished by the righteousness of the new Adam in Christ. And so, Paul preaches in 2 Corinthians of a new creation in Christ.
It is in this light that we now turn to address one last distinction we want you to keep in mind in this conversation about the goodness of creation. In Genesis 1, verse 31, it says, "And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good." The phrase very good could also be translated as perfect.
Why does this matter? Because most people hear the word perfect as being without a flaw or something along those lines. Keep in mind, Jesus commands, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," in Matthew 5:48. In both Genesis 1 and Matthew 5, the perfect means not an assessment in the law of perfection, such as having no flaw or blemish, or having something to do with a perfection of virtue.
Rather, the scriptural understanding of perfect refers more to the purposefulness and harmony of God's creation doing what God intends it to do. Specifically, all of creation works together in sustaining, serving, and protecting humankind. That is what makes creation not perfect, but very good.